Dear participants and all of you who are watching us, this is Somava Basu, founder and president of the Council for Global Cooperation. I welcome you all to a new event organized by the Vertex of the Cold War Project within the CGC. The CGC is an international non-partisan research forum aimed at tackling global issues that shape our modern world through independent research, timely analysis, and open dialogue. Today's session of the CGC focuses on a new book by Professor Suzanne Shirk entitled Overreach: How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, published in October 2022 by Oxford University Press. Suzanne Shirk is a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center in the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. Her research field is Chinese politics and foreign policy, and Professor Shirk is one of the most influential experts working on US-China relations and Chinese politics. She visited China in 1971 and has been teaching, researching, and engaging China diplomatically ever since. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs from 1997 to 2000. Her responsibility and diplomatic engagements included China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Apart from a recent book, Overreach, her other works include China, Fragile Superpower, The Political Logic of Economic Reform in China, How China Opened Its Door, Competitive Comrades, Career Incentives and Student Strategies in China, and her edited book, Changing Media, Changing China. Her articles and publications have appeared in leading academic publications, and her views on Chinese politics and foreign policy are highly sought. She is the co-chair of UC San Diego Forum on US-China Relations, the first ongoing high-level forum focused entirely on the US-China relationship, and director emeritus of the UC Institute of Global Conflict and Cooperation. She is the winner of 2015 Roger Revelle Medal. Welcome to the book discussion, Professor Shirk.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So the Cold War officially ended in 1991, but the tensions between two contrasting world ideologies are still present. Great power competition has not ceased with the fall of the Soviet Union, as also demonstrated by the various conflicts that broke out in the last decades. Therefore, it is of utmost importance to analyze the current relations between USA and Russia with the addition of influential powers hailing from Asia, such as China. Suzanne Shirk's book, Overreach, deals with China and its rise on the global stage. In her illuminating, lucid, yet persuasive new book, she investigates China's transition to superpower and portrays how China went from superpower to global heavyweight, and argues how our world is now embroiled in a new Cold War. Without further delays, let us welcome Professor Susan Shirk for her opening remarks as she talks about her new book. Over to you, Professor Shirk.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you about my book, Overreach. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to the feedback from readers in India as well as in other countries. I actually have a special interest in China-India relations and have wrote a chapter on that many years ago. But I'm eager to hear about the perspective of people in India toward China right now. So as you said in your very kind introduction, I'm an old China hand, and I've been studying China for more than 50 years, and first started doing research on China in the 1960s. And of course, Americans couldn't visit China at that time. So what we did is many of us spent time in Hong Kong, either looking at Chinese media materials. At the time, of course, it was all the official press. In my case, what I did is interview refugees who had been secondary school students in China for my dissertation and my first book called Competitive Comrades. So, of course, that was the Mao era. But for most of my career studying China, it's the post-Mao era. And during this post-Mao era, really, it's been a very positive experience to study China because living standards in China, as well as individual freedoms in China, expanded over this period, thanks to market reform and opening introduced by Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues in the late 1970s. And also China's relations with the United States and with other countries improved significantly as China became integrated into the global system, and it undertook a foreign policy of restraint and reassurance. Because there was quite a sophisticated understanding by Deng Xiaoping and other foreign policy makers in China that as the country improved its economic and military strength, it would be viewed as a threat by other countries. And so Chinese foreign policy was designed to reassure other countries that although it was growing in power, its intentions were friendly. And it certainly opened up its markets and became the largest trading partner of pretty much all of its Asian neighbors, as well as many other countries in the world. So China was a positive story for most of my career, but then things changed in the mid-2000s. And some of this was due to the global financial crisis, which was caused largely by the policy failures and institutional failures of the United States and other Western market economies. And China was less impacted by the global financial crisis. It also recovered more quickly than the United States and other countries did. And as a result, after the global financial crisis, there was an attitude in China of triumphalism that they were on the rise and the United States and other Western market economies were in decline. So the global financial crisis definitely was one of the causes for this shift in Chinese foreign policy and domestic policy. But my own research indicated, and I was doing this in real time as it was happening, was that a lot of this change actually happened even before the global financial crisis. China's foreign policy became more assertive, even aggressive, around 2006. And its domestic policy, in terms of social control over information, the commercial media, and the internet also became much tighter in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics of 2008 and before the global financial crisis. So that's how I started the research for this book, because there was this major inflection point, major shift from a restraint, a policy of restraint, both internationally and domestically, to one which was what I have called overreach. And what I mean by overreach, the definition of overreach, is to take things too far, to do things in an exaggerated way, in a manner that then snaps back to harm yourself. So my argument is that Chinese foreign and domestic policy, beginning in the mid-2000s, has really been costly to China itself and to the public in China, in that it's led to an international backlash. And what we see today certainly is an effort by the United States, India, other countries to organize coalitions to balance against China, because China, the country, is viewed as much more threatening today. And also domestically, after decades of pragmatic economic policy and unprecedented rapid growth over such a long period of time, the Chinese economy is also struggling. China once again has unemployment. So there's been a serious cost to Chinese domestic and foreign policy, domestically as well as internationally, which is why this term overreach, I believe, is really apropos, because Chinese policies are creating serious costs for Chinese society, economy itself. So, and of course, the subtitle is How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. So another important part of my argument is that China was rising peacefully up until this period. So some people have forgotten that. But in fact, up until the mid-2000s, things were going pretty well in terms of China's relations with the rest of the world, as well as improvement of the lives of people inside China. And so one of the most surprising findings of my book is that the shift begins not with the rise of Xi Jinping, who is a personalistic autocrat, call him a dictator, if you will, who has concentrated so much power in his own hands. But in fact, the shift begins even earlier, in a period of collective leadership, because thanks to the efforts of Deng Xiaoping and other reform-minded Chinese leaders like Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, in the 1980s, the Chinese leadership tries to create a collective leadership system that will prevent the tragic failures of the Mao era. So you have a kind of de-Maoization, although Deng Xiaoping's approach to that was not to criticize Mao personally, but to say this system of over-concentrated leadership under Mao had led to arbitrary decisions that were really tragically costly for Chinese society. And of course, the two most important examples of that are the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So the effort was to create a collective leadership. I mean, in a way, it was a strategy to try to preserve Communist Party rule, for sure. None of these leaders wanted to create a Western-style democracy, but they wanted to have a collective leadership so that there was not one dictatorial leader who could make arbitrary decisions that would be so harmful to China. Instead, there would be a kind of collective deliberation. There was delegation of the party's authority to the government, to the state council, China's cabinet, if you will, government officials who typically had more higher levels of education, expertise, a better understanding of what the situation was on the ground throughout China, more delegation to the government, and some checks and balances within what was still an autocratic political system. And those checks were primarily from within the party. So the Central Committee, which consisted of Chinese officials, provincial level officials, central officials, party officials, government officials, as well as military officers, that you had a arrangement that many years ago in my political logic book, I called reciprocal accountability, because the top leadership appointed the officials who then served in the Central Committee, but the Central Committee, according to party rules, had the authority to choose the top leaders. Top-down power was certainly stronger than the bottom-up power, but the leaders still had to anticipate the reactions of the subordinate officials in the Central Committee. So this provided some check on the autocratic authority of the leaders at the top. But so how did this overreach then develop in a period of collective leadership? That was a puzzle that I tried to understand in my book, and I lay out the dynamic of collective leadership, how it worked. And because we don't have that much time today, I'm not going to go over that right now. If people have questions about it, I'm happy to explain the surprising finding that overreach begins under collective leadership. But instead, I think people are probably more interested in how the Xi Jinping concentrated leadership system works today. But what the book shows is that there are these two very different types of political systems that China has experienced. Each of them has produced overreach. Of course, the collective leadership overreach is less acute than what we see today in this more concentrated leadership system. But let me just mention the overreach that began in the mid-2000s. In foreign policy, the most significant shift was related to maritime at territorial issues, especially in the South China Sea. what was very important about the way Chinese civilian maritime bureaucracies started trying to assert their sovereignty rights over the entire South China Sea, as well as land features within it, challenging Southeast Asian claimants to, and of course, according to the international law of the sea, those other claimants have rights to the waters as well as land features in their coastal zones, their exclusive economic zones. But China abridged those rights, challenged those rights, started confronting the Philippines, Vietnam, in the South China Sea, and also started confronting even American naval vessels in the South China Sea. So this drastically changed people's attitudes toward Chinese intentions. So it's not just that the South China Sea is a very important area for global commerce. It's also that China's aggressiveness in the South China Sea changed the narrative about what kind of rising power China was. Was it a rising power that would follow the rules and get along with its neighbors and other countries, or was it an aggressive, threatening rising power? So that was really very, very important. Domestically, we had this increase in tightening up of social control using a kind of grid surveillance method, which of course by today has become even more extreme thanks to new technologies. But even back then, in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics, these bureaucracies within the party and the government that I call the control coalition, they became very powerful and pursued, in China, it's called Weiwen, which is stability maintenance, through these methods, a lot tighter social control. Also, in the first 5 or 10 years of the 21st century, under the collective leadership of Hu Jintao, Chinese commercial media and internet had blossomed. There was a lot of debate online. There was investigative reporting. It was what you might call peak freedom of information in China that has not been achieved since. But in the lead up to the Olympics, the control coalition started, especially as more people started getting information online, they tightened up control. So these were the 3 areas of overreach that were really the most significant during that period. But now kind of shift. So what happens then? In the second term of Hu Jintao, this overreach continues. The control coalition and the government bureaucracies that wanted to restore more government management of the economy in the pursuit of indigenous innovation in China. They, after decades of decentralized market reform, these bureaucratic interest groups came together and started pursuing policies which we could call overreach. And by the end of the Hu Jintao era, and of course, one of the most significant features of collective leadership during this period was that the Chinese Communist Party worked out an arrangement for peacefully transferring power at the top after 2 5-year terms, which was a remarkable accomplishment for a communist autocracy, really the first time that that had occurred in any autocratic country, where you could peacefully have the leader retire instead of grasping power for his entire life until he was overthrown or died. Instead, you had Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao peacefully retiring and turning over power to a successor. Well, by the 2012, the end of Hu Jintao's 2 terms, when he was going to turn over power to a successor, Xi Jinping, who actually had been chosen by an informal internal election, there was an open split in the leadership. Bo Xilai, the party secretary of Chongqing, was making a power play to challenge Xi Jinping. And he was backed up by the control coalition, Zhou Yongkang being the internal security czar. You also had a major crisis in foreign policy with a confrontation in the East China Sea between China and Japan. So it's really a crisis atmosphere. It wasn't really clear that the turnover to Xi Jinping would occur smoothly, but somehow they navigated through it and Xi Jinping took power. At that point, Xi Jinping, who had misled other members of the political elite, as well as people in the public inside and outside China, into believing that he was going to be another very reform-minded official. Instead, he undertook to, from his perspective, preserve party power by disciplining the party membership to make sure that they would remain loyal to him and to the party, regardless of what happened in the society. He took the lesson of the collapse of the Soviet Union to mean that, which of course fell top down, not bottom up, that you had to make sure that loyalty was number one, and also to clean up the corruption that had developed during this Hu Jintao period of collective leadership. So he undertook a massive anti-corruption campaign beginning in 2013, which led to investigations, discipline, punishment of hundreds of thousands, actually, of Chinese officials. And the result of this anti-corruption campaign, which was also effectively a purge of all potential rivals to Xi Jinping, imagined rivals in his own paranoid thinking, as well as real potential rivals. So he began that in 2013, and it has continued right through his decade in power. And the consequence of this purge is that all the other officials in China are, frankly, terrorized by Xi Jinping's purge. And they're very worried that they have to find a way to demonstrate their loyalty to him. As a result, they try to figure out what Xi Jinping's preferred policies are. Then they leap on the bandwagon behind Xi Jinping as quickly as they can and carry out those policies in a manner that may even be more extreme than what Xi Jinping initially wanted. So the dynamic of the Xi Jinping personalistic, concentrated power generates overreach in that manner. And you get what you might call overcompliance by especially regional officials with Xi Jinping's policy. And you get that in foreign policy as well as domestic policy. And that has created a very serious backlash internationally as well as domestically. Now, interesting, the public actually sustained Xi Jinping's popularity up until very recently in this period of COVID. So the public supported the anti-corruption campaign. But of course, among the members of the elite, also many members of the urban middle class, well-educated urban middle class, they became increasingly disillusioned with Xi Jinping. So that's the dynamic under personalistic, concentrated power. We see a more aggressive Chinese foreign policy. Excuse me, everybody. There we go. You see a more the public, of course, in talking about Xi Jinping's overreach, there are a couple of examples that we have to flag. One of them is that Xi Jinping made a remarkable power move to eliminate the peaceful turnover of power at the top after 2 terms, introduced a change in the state constitution to enable him to cling to power after 2 5-year terms. So he put a target on his back. He told everybody he intended to hold on to power into a 3rd term and potentially forever, as long as he lived, which was a shock to many people inside and outside China. Another form of overreach was to sustain this extreme zero COVID management approach. Even when the variants changed to be less virulent, more contagious but less virulent. But he turned his zero COVID policy into a kind of symbol of his own power. He required all the other senior leaders to biaotai, to take a stand, a political stand behind his zero COVID policy. And so just in recent months, of course, we've seen this policy collapse. We saw protests over it. And now China is in a kind of disarray because it failed to make preparations for a transition from extreme zero COVID to a more flexible approach to managing the epidemic, and failed to vaccinate the older population in particular, instead putting all of the emphasis on constant testing, collective quarantining, including collective quarantining of people who never even had any symptoms or tested positive, but they were contacts of people in their same apartment building, say, who had tested positive. So we now have a situation in China that we may want to talk about, in which Xi Jinping's overreach is really snapping back, because what we see for the first time is that not just the elite, but the Chinese public has also become frustrated, disillusioned with Xi Jinping's leadership. In the last chapter of my book, so having described overreach under collective leadership, under personalistic leadership, the book is really mostly a book about how Chinese political system works and causes certain policy outcomes. But it's not a book on US policy per se, except in the last chapter, where I offer recommendations to China as well as to the United States for how to maintain stability in US-China relations and to prevent this overreach and American overreaction to the China threat, to leading to not just a Cold War, but potentially a hot war as well. So if you like, we can talk a little bit about my policy recommendations. I think one thing that people find interesting about the book is that my critique of the Chinese political system is really quite sharp, going back to collective leadership as well as Xi Jinping's personalistic dictatorship. You know, I don't pull any punches, and it's very frank. It's based on a lot of interviewing of political insiders and all sorts of people in China. And yet my recommendations to the United States are to avoid overreacting to the China threat and to test whether or not we can induce Xi Jinping to moderate his policies through diplomacy, rather than simply responding with sanctions and decoupling of the two highly integrated economies and research systems, rather than just doing that in order to prevent China from becoming stronger, What I recommend is that we combine carrots and sticks and diplomacy, use it in a way to test whether or not it's still possible to induce Xi Jinping to moderate his policies. My argument is that we really haven't engaged in any traditional diplomacy for 6 years under the Trump administration and 2 years of the Biden administration. So we really don't know for sure that we couldn't use diplomacy to achieve that stabilization of relations. So I argue against overreaction. I also believe that many of the measures that the Biden administration has undertaken are actually harming America's own competitiveness, especially restrictions on the flow of human capital between China and the United States. You know, really the strength of America is its openness to economic investment and trade, but also its openness to immigration and to allowing and encouraging some of the most talented people from all over the world to study at American universities and to become researchers or entrepreneurs in the United States. So I feel very strongly that some of the measures the US is undertaking, because it's so fearful of the China threat, will actually subvert, undercut America's own strength, its own competitiveness. So that's the conclusion of the policy chapter. So why don't I stop here and we can have some questions and answers now.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Your book is indeed a very interesting one and one of the very influential research works on China. So so thanks for that. It's indeed a very influential book. We would definitely come to the questions. Everyone is requested to drop their questions in the chat box, and we would definitely try to cover as much as possible. So my first question to you would be, as we know from history, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, two issues that can be considered the beginning of the first Cold War. In your in your book, you have mentioned about the second Cold War. Our world is embroiled in another Cold War. So when it comes to the second Cold War, which events or issues do you consider to be its inception phase? Some consider the COVID pandemic and some blame Trump's trade war. So how would you set the timeline for the beginning of the Cold War 2.0?
You know, one of the things that I'm really hoping to do now that I've completed this book is to refresh my own understanding of the first Cold War, which of course included not just the Soviet Union and the United States and other Western countries, but China as well. And so I'm sure many of you are more expert than I am about the timeline of the first Cold War. Of course, the most dangerous part of the first Cold War was the early years. And after a period of time, the Soviet Union and the United States did achieve a certain stability between themselves, an understanding of the you know, people talk about guardrails. I don't know if we can really talk about guardrails, but there was an effort on the two sides to achieve a certain détente between the two countries in order so that they would not blow one another up. And, so the way I've been thinking about it is just looking at the United States and China now. How do we achieve détente? What would it mean to try to achieve détente? So I don't have the answers to any of these questions. I think they're very interesting. I'm quite worried about US domestic politics, which have created a kind of bipartisan consensus that China is a massive threat to the United States, even though, compared to the way Russia's behaving today, to me, that's an overreaction because Russia's invaded other sovereign countries, tried to take over. In the Chinese case, that hasn't happened. And people say, oh, it's just a matter of time before they do that vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis Japan, other countries. But, China has so far exercised greater restraint. So how do we reinforce that restraint is the question. And I think it does require diplomacy as well as America's own strength.
Exactly. And coming to your book, one of the most interesting things I have found is your research on CCP structure and the politics in China, Chinese leadership. When it comes to a country like China, it is indeed difficult to work on these things to access documents, and it might have been really hard for you.
Well, certainly there's still so much I don't know. I try to get inside the black box of Chinese domestic politics, and I have some opportunities that other people might not have because I've been studying China for so long, going to China for so many years. I know a lot of people. I know people who are in quite significant positions of authority, who trust me to preserve the confidentiality of my sources so they won't get in trouble by talking to me. So I do have some knowledge of how things work, but there's still so many things that I don't know. And I feel that looking, for example, right now, how are all these decisions about COVID management made in the last 3 or 4 months? How much of it was a change in Xi Jinping's own position? How much was it other senior leaders who pressured him to make these changes? There's so much we don't know about what meetings went on, what kind of information was used. So I just hope that people interested in China will continue to try to dig into these questions, and that the Chinese people, will continue to travel outside of China or even immigrate outside of China so that we can learn by talking with them about how decision-making really works. I believe that people who read my book will learn more than they knew before about that, but it might leave them with just as many questions as it did before, because I certainly continue to have many questions.
So coming to the questions, we have a question from our researcher Yash Singh. You mentioned about the China's COVID policy in the wake of the protests against the draconian zero COVID measures last year. Do you think the threats of such upheavals in the future will nudge President Xi to finally recognize the groupthink that has developed within the standing committee and attempt to restrain similar policy overreach by overzealous party officials and state bureaucrats, at least within the domestic sphere, if not the international arena?
Oh, that's a great question. Someone has read the book very carefully. I'm struck by the fact that in the last couple of weeks, it appears that we see some adjustments in Chinese policy, which either are being caused by Xi Jinping's own recognition that his policies have backfired against him and against China, or it's other senior leaders who have debated with Xi Jinping, and their own more pragmatic views have come to prevail in certain areas. So, for example, we do see a moderation in foreign policy rhetoric. Wolf warrior diplomacy, tweeting and things like this calm down. We see in the treatment of private business, which of course has backfired against the Chinese economic dynamism, innovation, as well as created unemployment problems. We see an effort to persuade the private sector and international investors that China still appreciates the importance of the private sector. But is this just cheap talk, and will the private business people believe it or not? You know, it's quite possible that it will be very difficult to restore confidence from the private business people. Although international investors are rushing back in, because of course, people are predicting that after COVID peaks, starts to calm down, you're going to get a resurgence of economic growth in China, including consumption. And so naturally, commercial interests are saying, wow, this is the moment when we can really profit from our businesses in China. And I was just reading, I think it's from the IMF, is saying that the global economy is bottomed out and that we will get a resurgence of growth largely due to China's economic recovery. And that will help boost the whole global economy. So you can see the significance of what happens in the Chinese economy to the whole global economy. Other adjustments in policy. Trying to think. I don't think there are any others as significant, but those two are very significant. Treatment of the private sector and wolf warrior diplomacy. And of course, we should expect to see the Chinese policymakers who now feel very much challenged by the United States and its efforts to build balancing coalitions against China. They're going to try to put a wedge between America's relations with these other countries. And that means they're going to try to ingratiate themselves, reassure other countries that they're not a threat. So I would predict that we're going to see such an effort with Japan, South Korea, India, especially, and of course the European countries as well.
Yes, definitely. And we have our another question from Adarsh Tripathi, and he mentions, thank you so much, ma'am, for being here and for this brainstorming session. I have two questions for you. As the Chinese people traveling abroad and getting acquainted with ideas of democracy and individualism as the same thing which played a huge role in the collapse of the USSR, when its people came to know the lies of their ideology, which cannot feed its own people, how do you see China in this area, which has the largest diaspora in the world?
Largest diaspora. Yeah, I mean, it will be, that's a great question too. I mean, it will be extremely interesting to see how the exit of many people from China permanently or just starting to go abroad to study or do tourism again, how that will change things. I still don't see a massive disillusionment, political disillusionment with China's communist autocratic system of government from the public. You know, most people don't have a very sophisticated understanding of political science. What they care about is that they have jobs, the economy continues to grow, that their children have the opportunity to advance their careers, you know, and if there is a communist government that is somewhat responsive to the needs of the people, if they can do it through autocracy, I don't think that democratic representation, that there's a strong demand for that inside China. I think there is an increasingly strong demand from private business because they are at risk of being expropriated by a autocratic government, and they've experienced that. So they want more rights, and they certainly want more legal rights. But do they really want a democratic parliament? Are we going to say, you know, I believe the first group to demand that will be private business. But the public as a whole, I don't think there's a huge groundswell of demand for democracy in China. At some point, that may change. It may change as a larger share of the population it has higher education, travels abroad, the middle class keeps growing. You know, certainly people do want freedom of information. You know, they want certain rights, but I think they don't necessarily yet see the connection between those rights and an electoral democracy.
Yeah, and we have a question from Panos. Do you think that China will continue its silenced dominance and by the year 2040 could be the world's #1 superpower surpassing USA? And secondly, the last century, the most significant geopolitical issues had to do with Europe. Now, do you think the game is on Asia? So it's a kind of interesting question. Yes. So what would be your views?
Well, I think China's economy is going to grow more slowly. So what is interesting is whether or not the Chinese government can return to a more reassuring policy as it grows more slowly to reduce perceptions of a China threat that create a backlash against China. I don't know. I mean, people may have this view of the China threat in their minds that even when the economy is growing much more slowly, they may still see it as just as much of a threat. But of course, a lot depends on India. You know, people are really focused on India's future and whether or not the Indian economy can grow. I mean, right now, you know, India has a lot of internal problems too. They have a lot of internal political problems. But there is an anticipation that India, of course, will surpass China in population. And if India's economic policy could become more effective, there's no reason that India couldn't be, you know, a really serious competitor to China. No reason at all. As to Asia versus Europe, China's relations with its Asian neighbors are so important to China's own security. You know, it's surrounded by about 20 neighbors. And if they can, through effective diplomacy, economic integration, and other forms of cooperation, manage relations with their neighbors peacefully, that is like a huge security blanket for China. And frankly, from the standpoint of the United States, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that's a good thing. You know, I believe that the United States should aspire to a peaceful Asia, not just an Asia in which the US is #1. To me, primacy is the wrong goal. The goal is regional peace and order.
You have mentioned about your interest on China and Indian relations. I remember, and when it comes to Indian foreign policy, we have seen that how much India is currently having a balancing act when it comes to even after the issues of the border skirmishes. India has not taken a huge stand against its neighbor China. So my question to you would be like, is it possible to maintain greater? Is it possible for USA to fulfill the dream of the Indo-Pacific with a partner like India who has a balancing act, and how far India can lead this Quad or other multilateral platforms?
I mean, I think given the history of Indian foreign policy, it's a mistake to expect that India is prepared to stand staunchly against China in balancing against China. Because for one thing, there's a kind of trust deficit between India and the United States, as well as a trust deficit between India and China. So, what approach is really in in India's own interests? And if India can figure out a way to really benefit from greater economic integration as well as competition with China, obviously that's a good thing for India. I don't think it, I think there are many Americans who have unrealistic expectations for what India's stance will be. Of course, really everything also depends on how China behaves. If China, beyond the border conflicts, behaves really aggressively, not just toward India, but other Asian neighbors, then, I think India will certainly see its own interests in helping defend itself against China. But that hasn't happened yet, really. A Taiwan contingency could be a game changer here in the reaction of India as well as other Asian countries.
We have a question, again, it is similar to Sino-Indian problem. The question is from Yash Singh, and the question is, going by the assertion that by 2020, Xi Jinping had consolidated his hold over the Central Military Commission and hence the PLA, do you think the Chinese aggression at the Sino-Indian border in the past 2 years are being directed by the president himself, or are these acts of overreach by obsequious military officials to display compliance with his policies?
Yeah, it's really hard to know, isn't it? I don't have the answer to that question. I don't feel that I have a very good understanding of the internal dynamics of civil-military relations. And we do have instances, including when Xi Jinping was visiting India, of provocative actions by the Chinese military, even when Xi Jinping is visiting India, which obviously is not something that Xi Jinping benefits from. And yet, it's hard to see how Chinese generals would act counter to Xi Jinping's preferences in their actions. I mean, we saw some of that under Hu Jintao, but it's really hard to imagine that any general would dare behave that way under Xi Jinping. So I think, I mean, one of the advantages of this more centralized system is we can hold Xi Jinping responsible for military action.
So it was a really great conversation with you, Professor Shirk. My last question would be to you that I'm sure many like me wants to know, but again, this doesn't have any definite answer. So what is the best way to contain China? And you have mentioned about US's perspective in your book in the last chapter, how the policies should be towards China for USA. But when it comes to other countries of Asia or other nations of third world countries. So my question to you would be, what is the best way to contain and resist China and any aggressive polarization? What would be Professor Suzanne Shirk's advice to global leaders and policymakers?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put it the way you're putting it, which is containing China. I don't believe our goal should be to contain China. I think we should assume that China is a regional and global power, that it will have these ambitions, and that these ambitions are not necessarily antithetical to the interests of other countries. If China plays a responsible role in the regional and global arena. So I don't worry about a powerful China. I'm not interested in containing China. What I am interested in is using the leverage, American leverage, Indian leverage, other countries, to communicate clearly to China's leaders that if they do behave responsibly and cooperatively, we're prepared to get along with them, and that it will be mutually beneficial. It's not a zero-sum game. So the challenge is how to use smart diplomacy, plus maintaining our own strength, military, economic, technological, but then to try to induce a responsible, ambitious China by withholding our favors or providing our favors, depending on how they behave. So seems to me that's a more sensible approach that will lead to a more peaceful world, also a world in which the important countries in the world will be able to cooperate on global threats like climate change, like epidemics. I mean, seems to me that would be in everyone's interest.
It's true. And so what would be your next research project? Like I have also read your book, China, the Fragile Superpower, where the China was in its phase where it was growing as a superpower, and in Overreach, China had almost achieved its status of superpower. And so what would be your next research project on China?
Well, I'm really very interested in really, I'm a comparative politics scholar primarily. So I'm very interested in Chinese domestic political economy. And very interested in the future of private business in China and whether or not what its future looks like, because I believe that for the private sector to play its role as a creator of jobs and dynamism, it requires political and legal reform in China. Because right now there's no real channel for private business people to articulate their interests through the Communist Party. So I think that parliamentary system and more autonomous legal system are really necessary for the private sector to play its the role it should be playing in the Chinese economy. And certainly if the Chinese Communist Party continues to kind of intimidate the private sector the way it's been doing and favor state-owned enterprises, you know, Chinese economy will not grow the way it should. The state-owned, the waste of human investment, financial investment, tremendous. State-owned enterprise is not the solution to China's economic future. So I'm very interested in what happens with the private sector and the future of the private sector, including the diaspora. And so anyway, that's the topic that I'm intrigued with right now.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And we would be definitely waiting for your next project to come up. As I mentioned, our CGC have a vertex on the Cold War studies, the Cold War project. So it would be really, as for your previous books, your new project would also be of our very interest and our research areas. So it was really nice talking to you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. And I hope that in addition to the people who've been on the call, other people will read the book and give me their feedback. I look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.